So in class we began to talk about a movement called realism that began in 1848 in France as a response to Romanticism and Neoclassicism, an attempt on artists' part to depict everyday scenes, in particular focusing on the downtrodden working class. And in class we talked about the motivations for this that came out of 1848. So go back and play the screencast for that. In this particular screencast today, this artifact will talk about how realism spread to America and how in America the realist movement was in fact a bit different than what it had been in France, although it shares many characteristics. The artist on the right, Winslow Homer, is one of the most prominent exemplars of the realist movement in America. And in fact, he had spent a year in Paris in 1867, 1868, when realism was the single most avant-garde movement in France, and seems to have been very much impressed by this new movement and its focus on the daily lives of the often impoverished rural working class. At the same time, Romanticism still lingered on, and I think in addition to the realist movement, we'll see in Homer's work numerous romantic elements as well. So he comes back to America from his trip abroad and brings back to the United States these interesting images of common folk. Here we see a rural schoolhouse, very, very simple. The land recently cleared for the little one-room schoolhouse. A mother dutifully bringing her children to school, the other kids waiting before school starts to go in. You'll notice the big difference between Homer's brand of realism and the French brand, as represented by Millet on your left, is that this is not really an image of labor. There is no hard work going on here, no back-breaking time spent trying to glean what one can in the fields. Rather, it's significantly more leisurely. And in fact, many of Homer's images seem to evoke a simpler way of life that the rural communities present, rather than the bustle of city life, which is what Homer probably was every bit as much familiar with. This idea that nature is pure, simple, and unadulterated by industrial progress is in fact a theme that we saw in a lot of romantic paintings. And again, Homer, I think, channels both realism and romanticism from his trip to Paris in the late 1860s. This interest in a sort of nostalgic escapism away from industry is, in fact, probably also fueled by movements in America at that time. 1870s was immediately after the Civil War, a period in American history called the Reconstruction, where America is trying to build itself back after having been ravaged by a war against itself. These images by Homer that suggest a more peaceful and really an apolitical world may well be a way of reflecting his hopes for what America should be, what it should get back to being in the aftermath of the war. Now, some of Homer's works focus on labor, as the French works did. One of his most famous works in the National Gallery, Breezing Up, shows an older fisherman with his three young helpers returning to port after a day's work. The belly of their boat filled with fish, the name of the port from which they sailed on the back, Gloucester in Massachusetts, where Homer had spent some time painting. Unlike French images from the realist movement, Homer and American realism tends to be not so much steeped in Marxist socialism. The workers that we see are heroic rather than downtrodden. In fact, if we look closely at the figures, they're really quite relaxed, almost as if they're enjoying this part of the day. The sail back into the port, the work is done, and they're having some fun enjoying the breeze at their backs. as it carries them swiftly into port. Again, there's probably some romantic elements here, sort of this peaceful coexistence with nature, something we saw with some British romantic painters, certainly bleeding over here, using nature and its forces to help us with our work. So as a realist picture, it's really similar in some ways. It focuses on rural labor, but in other ways very different. It's not trying to highlight any sort of social crime against these people. The sun shines brightly on their sails. Now, when he originally painted this, the original design for the picture had the old man that you see in red manning the till rather than holding the sail. But when he finally showed the work for the first time, he changed this over and put the young boy at the till rather than the older man. This first exhibition of the work was in 1876, which is a fairly monumental year in American history. It's the 100th anniversary of the birth of the country. And the exhibition that he put it in was mounted specifically to celebrate America's first 100 years, our birthday. And so the change came with this exhibition. And I think it's very much inspired by a sense to add meaning to the picture. The old man, his job is now given over to a young boy. The young boy is a symbol of promise for the new era, the new centennial that's coming up. And if we look at what's going on in the picture, the old man is holding the sails. He's got us this far. But he's given over the reins. He's given over the helm to the next generation. This is really where America is in 1876, the end of one centennial and the beginning of another. So the work, which seems simple and idyllic at first, also is rather a potent symbol for America in 1876. The other great American realist painter is Thomas Eakins, who lived in Philadelphia. Homer spent most of his time in New York before moving into New England, where he painted Breathing Up. But Eakins spent the majority of his career in Philadelphia. He also had traveled to Paris and had seen realist paintings firsthand. In fact, he spent even more time in Paris than Homer did, almost 4 years. At exactly the same time Homer was there. Eakins was there from 1866 to 1870. But they never seem to have overlapped with each other while they were there. They seem to have been traveling in different circles, independent from one another. As a scene of everyday life that certainly fits into the realist mode, our oarsmen here, though hard at work, are in recreation. And this, again, sets it very much apart from the sort of socialist pictures that the realist movement inspired in France. Rather than being about hard work, it's really about leisure and play. Now, Eakins was an amateur oarsman himself, and he really knew what it meant to row a pair-oared shell like this one. And the Bigland brothers were champion oarsmen, and they had gone on tour sort of to show off, and you can see other oarsmen in the background behind them. This is Barney Bigland. His brother John is in front of him, or behind him, depending on how you read it, the other oarsman. And you'll notice that what Eakins has done is to capture this moment, right, when Barney Bigland is waiting a split second. He's timing his oar so that, when his brother John's oar hits the water, he starts to pull as well, which is exactly how, I guess, one does this sort of thing. So Eakins is really very, very precise on the actions of our oarsmen and focuses on the professionalism of Barney Bigland, his knowledge of the craft and how important that is for his success. Eakins was fastidious with really all of the details of his painting. In fact, for some of his rowing pictures, he did perspective studies so that he could get the waves proper and rendered in perspective on the water. There's a great quote from Akins that he says that reflections are so beautiful that one should make the effort to get it right. And so here, for a different picture, we can see how each of the waves has been laid out as part of a perspective grid. And I think you get the sense that he's probably done that for the Bigland brothers' picture as well, as they recede into distance in perfect perspective. The other thing that Akins did for precision was to study anatomy by attending dissections at the Jefferson Medical College in Philadelphia. And in particular, he attended dissections headed by Dr. Samuel Gross, who you see illustrated here in the middle of not a dissection, because this is a live patient, but rather in the midst of an operation where he's explaining what he's doing to the assembled students in the medical theater. While he was in Europe, Akins had been looking at art. Obviously, he'd been influenced by the realist movement. That was really all the rage at the time he was there. But over and above that, he'd been looking back at older European art, which he'd never really had much of a chance to see firsthand. And Caravaggio obviously made a huge impact on Akins. You can see the sort of Caravaggio lighting coming in on a diagonal, right, from the side, just as Caravaggio's comes in on an angle, highlighting the figures. A sort of limited color palette built around ochres and dirt tones, browns and reds and yellows. All of this came from his study of Caravaggio. He was also equally interested in Rembrandt. This one's not in your text. I wish it were. The anatomy lesson of Dr. Tulp, which is in The Hague, and certainly something that Akins would have seen in his travels through Europe, and in many ways seems to form the basis for the Gross Clinic. This is another way in which realism in America at least seems to sort of separate from European realism. For the French, the realist movement meant abandoning old traditions and staving out for something brand new. But for the Americans, old European art was to them quite new. There were no major public museums in America yet. There's no place to see these works of art in color. They might have seen reproductions and lithographs in black and white in magazines, but they're maybe line engravings, but the actual article itself was not something they were familiar with. So for them going to Europe, these works became a prominent touchstone, much more so than they would have been on French artists who are used to seeing these sorts of things. Now, as I mentioned, this is not a anatomy lesson, but Samuel Gross is operating on a live patient. So we have an anesthesiologist covering the face with anesthetic. We have assistants spreading open the incision as Gross takes a second to explain what he's doing to the assembled group. He's actually removing some dying bone from this man's thigh. And this is a procedure that he himself had pioneered and had recently published in a book. Brought him, in fact, really quite great fame. He was one of the more famous doctors of the period. Simply because of his new techniques in surgery. This is exactly why Akins chooses to paint him. This painting was actually made to celebrate the centennial of America, the 100th anniversary of America. And, in fact, there was a major exhibition in Philadelphia in the year, the end of the first 100 years in 1875, called the Centennial Exhibition. The one that Homer had shown in was a smaller show up in New York. But in this major Centennial Exhibition, there was a theme. Artists were asked to submit works on the theme of American progress. And Akins chose for this exhibition to show Samuel Gross as the embodiment of the advances of American surgery, how far ahead of the Europeans we have come in our 100 years. To do this, he has the light shine on the bald head of Gross, and the way his hair comes off to the sides almost gives him a halo effect, as if he's almost been deified for his actions. Well, when Aiken submitted this to the jury for the centennial exhibition, they were shocked. Maybe shared the reaction of the woman behind, we presume to be a relative of the boy on the table. They said there's too much blood, it's way too disgusting. You know, I think America was not as much interested in or even ready for the sublime in art in the way that we saw in French paintings from the Romantic period. And what happened was that the painting was rejected from the art part of the centennial exhibition in 1875, and instead it was hung in a makeshift hospital that was set up to show American progress in medicine. And there we see it in the back, hanging amongst a bunch of beds. So in other words, it was seen really not as being art, but as being an illustration of a medical effect. So with this screencast, we've seen how American realism feeds on advances in French realism, but at the same time